In this video, we're going to take a look at Organic Studio's Potassium. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion.
A soft purple tone to look at. Even though it's a bit darker, it's a soft tone, not light. There is some tone variation by nib, but otherwise, this is a fairly consistent tone and color. The tone variation for most nibs is very subtle. Only the tiniest touches of shading from time to time. So this isn't something we're looking at that's going to be some kind of shade monster. You have to be looking at this to really get a very nice purple and be happy with that. As a purple, we get a very enjoyable tone that's really nice on the readback from the page. And I'm going to wind up saying this next part again. This is a great darker purple, not dark purple, that never tries to be anything else. And it does it very well.
I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is
a Sailor Yellow with a broad nib.
It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the fine nib, this is the lighter tone that we tend to get. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it only has the slightest hint of some darker areas that can occur, but not very much. More if on the fourth line, when you see eyes come up, it looks a little bit lighter than Voltaire right next to it. But not here for the shading, here for the great purple tone that we're getting on the page. Looking at the medium nib, it's a bit darker than we had with the fine. We get no feather, no spread, no shading. Really like the way this is coming up as a darker tone. It's darker, not dark. Never tries to cross towards being so dark it's black purple. Not at all. This is a beautiful purple on the page, especially given paper that's going to let this color pop. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the medium. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get no shading. I mean, maybe you find one or two spots like the, I don't know, the cross and the T of objects, but not really. Just a beautiful purple on the page. It almost makes me wish I was using yellow Rhodia at this point, but I'm going to have to order that for in the future, I think. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no issues whatsoever.
To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Pilot Metropolitan with a fine nib, a Pilot Metropolitan with a medium nib, a Pilot Metropolitan with a 1.0 stub, The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine, even though this paper is not as bright a white. Looks very nice, with no feather, with no spread, with no shading. Again, we're not here for the shading on this ink. I love shading, but this color, I think, is doing such a standout, great job. It's just enjoyable to look at. Again, the readback, very nice. Looking at the medium nib, we get it a little bit darker than we had with the fine, just a little bit. Now, we do see a little bit of feathering going on and fairly consistent all over. It's readable, it's usable, I think most people would go with it, but it is there. We're not getting any kind of spreading. We're not getting any kind of shading. Just a tad bit darker purple. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the medium. We do still get that tiny little bit of feathering that's going on, and it is incredibly tiny feathering that's going on, and only in a few spots. We're getting no spread. We're getting no shading. We're just getting to really see this ink beautifully. Looking at the back of the page, this much ghosting had me worried about bleeding, but it did not bleed through and touch the page underneath. I just don't think you could use the back of this page. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in an AmPad Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, there is a change in the tone of what we've had from the others. The yellow paper is affecting it a little bit, and it is coming in a little bit darker than we had on the other papers. Now, we're not getting any feathering. I say any because I almost thought I saw some, but I'm not seeing any feathering. I'm not seeing any spread. Really, it's doing very well here. We're not getting any shading. Shouldn't expect it with this ink, I think, at all, even though we can get a few spots. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a tad bit darker than the fine. Only a smidgen, really. It does feather a little bit. Look at the word the on the top line, the H. You see just a little bit of feathers going on. Same within the L, but you really got to look for them. On the third line, you're going to see it in referring. Not going to be a problem. Not a reason to not use this ink. Spread, there is a little, very under control, and there is no shading. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the medium. We still get a little bit of feathering, tiny feathers that are there when you really do look at certain letters. You'd probably, if I zoomed way in, you could see it, and if I have to zoom way in to show you feathering, then I'm looking a little too hard, I think. No real spread. I think it's doing very well. No shading, although I will say there is some tone variation you're going to see on the bottom line. In the bottom left area of the writing, looks a little lighter than some around it.
Looking at the back of the page, none of this bled through and touched the page underneath, but the amount of ghosting we're getting here, you can't use the back of the page without losing both sides of notes.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a National Steno notebook.
Looking at the fine nib, this looks different than any of the other writing so far. It's much darker than any of the other times with the fine. Now, we're not getting any feathering. We're not getting any spread. I don't think we're getting the same beautiful purple here. We're getting a purple. I just don't think it's as nice on this paper, which is a shame because this is one of my favorite Steno pads. No shading whatsoever. Looking at the medium nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the fine. A lot of the same things. Now, in the fine, when there was no feather, here you actually will see a little feather come up in the word Calvinist on the top line. You'll see it in battles on the second line. I mean, it's there. It's not something that's a major problem, but it's there. There's not really any spread, and there is no shading here, but it's certainly feathering with the medium when it didn't on the fine. Looking at the stub nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the medium. We get feathering, a little bit more than we had with the medium. You see it in evening, you see it in and, you see it in Voltaire on the second line, arguments on the second line, whole on the third line. There's a lot of feathering there. There's the slightest bit of spread going on. This ink doesn't seem to be doing well with this paper. There is a little bit of tone variation that we will see, but not very much. Looking at the back of the page, we see that there's quite a bit of ghosting. You may get away with using the back of this page. That would be up to you. I probably wouldn't. Nothing bled through and touched the page underneath.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Birmingham Pen Company's Waterford Dusk. Here is Diamine Majestic Purple. Here is Noodler's Lorraine Mauve. Here is Sailor Ink of the Witch. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot Steno notebook.
Looking at the fine nib, we're back to what we've been getting tone-wise from this. Just a tad bit darker. It's not exactly the same. The tone of the paper's still having some effect, but it is not like it was on the last paper. Now, we're getting no feather. We're getting no spread. We're getting no shading. We're getting very solid performance with this paper that I had the lowest expectations of when I got it. I got this one to be my crappy paper, and it's doing good. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than we had with the fine. Do we get some feathering? Yes, we do. It's not made for fountain pens. I think the feathering's rather under control, as in it doesn't stop you from using it, but it's definitely there and quite a bit of it. There is a tiny bit of spread, but it is not bringing it all the way up to a broad, just a little bit thicker than that medium would normally be. Shading, of course not. Not here. Not with this ink. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the medium. we get feathering, and it's much more obvious, again, as true. First two words. You see it a little bit with for. You see it a little bit indeterminate on the second line. Reject on the third. Them on the third. So, yeah, it feathers. The spread, I think, is fairly under control. Very tiny, but it is there. Shading, non-existent. Looking at the back of the page, we see that the ghosting's fairly under control. You might be able to use the back of the page if you chose to. Nothing bled through and touched the page underneath.
While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page.
Here is a green ink by Graf von Faber-Castell, their Moss Green. Here is a gray ink by Pen BBS, number 130 FDR. Here is a pink ink by Lavender, their Pinkly. Here is a yellow ink by Diatramentis, their Emma Goldman or Gold.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the fine nib, it is darker than we've generally had. We do get feathering. We do get spread. I do think that with this nib, it is usable as long as it's not going to be destroying the page underneath. We do not get shading, but we haven't had very much of it on most of the papers not made for fountain pens. Really comes through on the nicer papers, and these are the more economy ones I've gone to at this point. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit darker than we had with the fine. It feathers, yes it does, and a lot. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't use this. Would I use this at school grading a paper? No, I wouldn't, because I don't want to have to write ginormous for them to see. Then it's like I'm yelling at them. But I think for most people, they probably could, and it would be all right. There's a little bit of spread, probably manageable for most, and there's no shading. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had in the medium. We get feathering, just like we did with the medium, constant tiny feathers all over it. Some of the feathers even have feathers. It does spread a little bit, but you can still very clearly tell the difference between the side and the downstrokes of that stub, so it's not washing it out. Now, shading? Nah, this is 20-pound copy paper. Don't ask about shading. Looking at the back of the page, I was really hoping that it wouldn't bleed like it did, but it did touch the page underneath an awful lot. And when you see the back of the page, there's no question why. The amount of ghosting, you can't use the back.
So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
I think this ink really is a winner in any pen, so it certainly slides right into that dealer's choice category. But I enjoy it the most from the medium flow broad nib. I've been getting really lucky because generally my pen of the day choice is pretty random, and the fact that it went in that Sailor really worked well. It was a beautiful match in its writing, and I don't know that I would have enjoyed it as much if I didn't get it into a pen that was going to make it write so nice. And I'm going to repeat what I said earlier because I said I would. It's a great purple that never tries to be anything else. It's going to look good in every pen.
I hope you got something out of this video, and if you did, do all that YouTubery stuff. Thanks for watching.